Hello, and welcome to Paranormal in Pennsylvania.
Where we discuss history and haunts.
Today's story takes us down south to Paranormal Outside of Pennsylvania in New Orleans. I'm Sarah.
And I'm David.
Let's get started. So David, you and I just got back from a weekend in New Orleans.
Yes, we did. Absolutely fantastic time. Would happily go back.
Yes, in 2.5 days we did 5 museums, 1 tour, and countless restaurants.
Yes. So much food.
A
Very
great
happy.
time. And we were super excited to go because as we're filming this, it is November 1st. So we were there over Halloween weekend. Obviously, we have a love for the paranormal and we're very interested in learning more about what the city had to offer because there's so much rich culture and there's so much lore surrounding New Orleans. So the thing I was most excited for on the trip was this tour that we took, and it was an adults-only ghost, voodoo, and vampire tour. And the reason it's adults only is because it's more candid, and it gets into some topics that wouldn't have been sensitive
Yes,
to kids.
Yes, and our tour guide certainly didn't err away from profanity.
Yeah, not that she will literally ever hear this, but Miss G, if you heard this, crushed the tour.
Oh yeah, it was great.
I think it was by Witch's Brew Tour Company. They have a lot of options. If you're down there, highly recommend. Quick plug for them. But we're going to focus on just one of the stops from this tour. It was a 2-hour tour. This also focuses primarily on ghosts and vampires and not so much voodoo. So the legend that we're going to talk about is the legend of the Casket girls. And in the 1700s, these women arrived in New Orleans and they were sent there with their belongings in a coffin-shaped chest. And this lends itself to the Casket girls. It's an odd shape. They were chosen by the Bishop of Quebec to foster quality marriages in New Orleans. Previously, New Orleans was known for gambling, partying, prostitution.
Sure, yeah.
They really wanted to turn around the reputation.
Sure.
The only goal of these Casket girls was to arrive in New Orleans, find a good husband, get married, and have as many children as possible to populate New Orleans.
Not the worst deal on the planet.
Especially not for back then, you know? If you are just going to be married off anyways, why not go to this new exciting place? Now, for me, terrible deal because it is so humid down there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It is. It can be quite humid in New Orleans, you know, it being a swamp.
Right.
Former swampland, but...
Yeah. I don't do well with heat. I don't do well with humidity. So this would not be for me.
Yeah.
And it also wasn't really for these women because they were not well received. Even not taking into account the fact that they carried their belongings in coffin-shaped boxes, people did not like them.
Yeah, do we know any historical background of the coffin-shaped
It seems like it was
trunks?
weird even for back then.
Yeah, it seems like a very inefficient space.
Yeah.
Or like shape.
I agree. Everyone deemed them too pale to exist in New Orleans because they constantly got sunburnt. These women were women of society who weren't used to being outside and definitely weren't used to the intense sun that the South has.
As a man of extremely high society, I can very much relate because outside is bad. Outside bad.
I think maybe not a man of extremely high society, but a man of very little melanin, rather.
Oh, okay.
I did bring, you know you're pale, I'm pale. We brought sunscreen to go to New Orleans in October. I mean, come on.
My ginger hair means I can tan like no other. I have no idea what you're talking about.
So these women were not well received. And until they found marriages, which ended up taking longer than they thought, they were to live with the nuns who would ensure their purity. In addition to the women not being deemed good wives by the local men, the men were not husband material. They regularly disrespected women, and they had absolutely no idea how to interact with these women of high society. As a result, there was a lot of clashes and really no decent pairs. Some of the Casket girls were placed into unwanted marriages, and others who started to get too old for marriage turned to prostitution to pay their bills. When the King of France found out, he demanded that these girls return to France. The nuns ran upstairs to grab the coffin chests, grabbed the coffin chests and ran upstairs, rather, to the third floor where these casket girls were staying. Now, this floor was unlike a normal third floor. The windows had been sealed shut to preserve the innocence of these casket girls. And we kind of found this a theme in New Orleans, actually. There was something called the Romeo ring, or
Romeo bars,
one of the
spikes.
other, something like that, where because things are lofted in New Orleans and there's poles used to support the buildings, if there was a pole that led up towards the room of an unwed female, they would put this ring of spikes around the pole to prevent men from climbing up the pole.
Yeah, but upon looking at those, it didn't look like a very good preventative measure. If anything, it looked like a spot to help you hoist yourself up.
And I think that you think that because you're 6'4".
I don't know.
I don't think the average person could reach them. And I'm sure they were also way sharper when they haven't been run down by 300 years of environment.
That's a very fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not a practitioner of parkour.
Right. So this, like I said, this is a theme, this purity. And in addition to the windows being nailed shut, the door was also sealed shut, and opening and closing it was controlled by the nuns. If the women wanted to leave, they needed to be escorted by one of the nuns, and they never left without the nuns' knowledge because they couldn't.
I find it just out the gate very strange that the nuns controlled the door as well.
Mm-hmm.
That seems, if these are women pure, and this is the nun house, I wonder how often even men were coming into the establishment.
I'm sure not often.
So it's very interesting, I guess very strict to me, that they would still lock them in at night as well.
Yeah.
Or during the day, I don't know.
Here's where we get into the paranormal occurrences. After giving the girls some time to pack their coffin chests, they returned to the third floor. And upon unsealing that door, they found that the coffins were still there, but they were completely empty and the girls were completely missing. Now again, there was no way for the girls to get in and out of the floor, especially holding all of their belongings. The nuns decreed that the women were not what they had said, they were not human, and that they were vampires, or that they had transported vampires in their coffin chests, and the vampires had devoured the women, leaving no trace.
Yeah, I find that part of the story to be a little interesting, because certainly if vampires devoured the women, there might be a blood drop or a blood stain, some evidence that of a struggle.
And I think, I think I'm on the same page as you, where I would say that if we're going to follow this tale, I would say the women themselves were vampires, especially going back to how they burned in the sun. We know that's a trope of vampirism.
Definitely agree.
With this occurrence, the nuns and Pope deemed the third floor cursed and spared no expense at sealing it off, even more than it was. The Pope himself blessed nails to nail the window and door shut. It's said that in 1987, a visiting Pope re-blessed all of the nails to continue to keep the evil inside the third floor. This was the beginning of really calling the women vampires, because the Pope going back and doing it gave more credence to this lore, and vampires have become more and more prevalent in pop culture with things like Twilight and...
Oh yeah, I mean, there's been a revival of the romanticization of vampires, or just even making them, again, prevalent in horror culture.
Right. But there were other things that happened while the casket girls were there that also raised eyebrows in society. Neighbors of the convent fell ill, many of them, not just one or two, and it seemed to almost radiate out from the convent. Crops in nearby areas began to fail, gardens failed and died, so it just seemed like something evil was affecting the surroundings. In 1978, paranormal investigators went to see if they could detect the presence of these women or any other, quote, vampires in the area. The nuns, of course, did not want them there and kicked them off the property. They sat on an opposing corner and aimed a video camera at the nunnery all night long. They started to get drowsy and apparently had a little bit of drinks, and they failed to notice that the third floor windows were opening and shutting.
That is very spooky, especially considering that they should be sealed with holy blessed nails or just nails in general.
So it can't even be the wind. They fell, and that's said to be caught on camera. Shortly after that happened, they're said to have fallen asleep, with the camera still running. The next morning, their bodies were found ripped up as if by animal claws, but there's a really interesting element about this. There was no blood clots at the site of the wounds, minimal blood on their clothes, and upon being autopsied, it was found that they seemingly were already completely drained of blood.
That is very spooky.
Yes. Doesn't stop there. In addition to these vampire stories, it's said that the ghosts of the nuns can be seen walking the halls, tending to the spirits of the sick and dying. Some say these nuns remain in the nunnery not to care for the spirits of sick and dying, but to fight the evil that's there left behind by the Casket girls, even after death.
That's spooky, but a little bit, part of that is more lighthearted, that they're just still tending to the sick and innocent, but I certainly do like the idea that they're fighting and warding off the evil still to this day.
Yeah, I like that too. I think it seems like there's something going on there, and the idea of these undead nuns fighting it sounds like not the worst.
Yeah, so with the third floor being, still sealed, and with the paranormal crew being killed, do you think that there is actually something there? Or a coven of vampires?
I don't know if there's a coven of vampires there, but I think there's something going on. To answer the question we always cover on this podcast of would I visit it? Absolutely not. We stood on the corner where the video camera was placed while we were on the tour, and I was nervous to even take a picture of it. I would not go inside the walls surrounding it. I wouldn't go to the third floor, and I certainly wouldn't do it at night. And I definitely wouldn't do anything to try to taunt this place.
Yeah, so for me, I think that I would go to the third floor during the day, but with the utmost respect, not with the idea of opening the door or looking at anything, not trying to reveal anything, because I guess to me, from what it sounds like, and of course I'm no expert, and this is just my hot take, it sounds like whatever is there just wants to be left alone and not to be revealed or found out.
That's why I wouldn't even go inside. It's just not worth it.
I guess that is fair, but I just think it would be if you're trying to find out what is there, that is when it's aware of you, versus just looking upon, either the third floor or even the door that's sealed.
I would not go.
I totally get that. And of course, this is also being bold right now.
Yeah.
That in the moment, would I actually go through with it? I don't know.
Big words behind a microphone from Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
Yeah. If you're listening, let us know if you would go. I'm interested what other people would think. I think this is the first time that we've said we would not go into a place on this podcast at all. So I'm interested to hear what other people think. Thank you guys for listening to our first episode of Paranormal Outside Pennsylvania, and tune in next Thursday to see where in Pennsylvania we explore next.